Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Good morning, saints. Let us bow for a word of prayer. O gracious and eternal God, we want to thank you for another day's journey. We give you all the praises this morning. I ask a special blessing on our church family this morning, a special blessing on Pastor Fajay and his wife. I ask you to touch our bereaved, our sick and shut in. I also ask you to move Shirley and you step in, that we may be fulfilled with your word this morning. These and other blessings I ask in your name. Amen. Our topic for this morning is Hagar and Ishmael are not forgotten. Our devotional reading comes from Jeremiah 29:10 through 14. Our background scripture, Genesis 21:8 through 21. And our key verses, Genesis 21:17 through 18. And it comes from the King James Version. And it states, "And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven, and said unto her, What aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation." Author, not stated but traditionally attributes to Moses. A date, Moses lived around the 1400 BC, but the events of Genesis date to the very beginning of time. A female servant serving as a surrogate mother, a police, was the accepted cultural practice of the day. According to this practice, Hagar should have been accorded the same privileges as a wife, privileges ignored when Abraham sent her away. It should be noted that Hagar is the first person to encounter the angel of God in the book of Genesis, and she is the first woman to receive promises from God. Genesis 16:11 through 12. She is the only person in the Hebrew scriptures to name God. Genesis 16:13. Some key persons to remember are Abraham, the chief patriarch and father of the Hebrew people. Hagar, a slave woman and servant to Sarah. She was given to Abraham to be a wife and give birth to Ishmael. Isaac, the only born to Abraham and Sarah. He was one of the patriarchs of the Hebrew people. Ishmael, the son born to Abraham and Hagar. He began the patriarch of many nations. Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Some key terms to remember are Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian maid, the mother of Ishmael. Mocking, it is defined as to laugh, make sport, jesting. Wean, to laugh, make sport, jesting. Death deals with ripened, weaned a child. Our chronological setting of the lesson, the time that Abraham lived has not been without challenges and disagreement among biblical scholars. The most likely date used is during the time of the third dynasty of Ur, approximately 2113 to 2006 BC. There are simply not enough historical markers in the story of Abraham and Sarah to make a definite statement about the date of the event covered in Genesis 21 through 50. Abraham and Sarah waited an entire generation for the promise of God to be fulfilled. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the Lord promised to make Abraham a great nation and make his name great, and that Abraham would be a blessing to many people. God promised to bless all those who blessed him and to curse all those who cursed him. Genesis 12 and 4. Abraham was 75 years old when the Lord called him to leave Haran and travel to Canaan. The main obstacle to the fulfillment of the Lord's promise was Sarah's barrenness. The events of Genesis 12, 1 through 21 occurs over a period of approximately 28 years. Genesis 12 and 4, Genesis 16 and 3, Genesis 16, Genesis 17 and 1, 24 through 25, Genesis 18, 9 through 14, Genesis 21, 1 through 8. Clearly, these passages point out that the promise of God are sure and certain, although they may not come at the time when one might have expected them. God promises will certainly be fulfilled. The geographical and cultural setting of the lesson. The life of Abraham and Sarah began in the ancient Near East, Ain. The ancient Near East referred to the various civilizations and culture that comprised the land that included Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant. A portion of this land is referred to as the Fertile Crescent, a region that includes the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. The land of Canaan was always at the center of the geopolitical conflict because of the strategic location. It formed the land bridges between Africa and Asia. This region of the world produced some of the greater world empires, to include the Assyrians, Babylonians, Medes, and Persians. Our introduction this morning deals with hopelessness. It is more than a feeling unhappy. It is a deep-seated belief that one's life situation will never change. In the midst of this growing despair, the black churches never wavered in her faith and belief that God was still with his people. Since the early days of her existence in America, the black church has always preached a message of hope and inspiration that the future will always be brighter. The message that resound in the story of Hagar, a slave woman who was misused and cast aside by her mistress, is plain to see. God is always on the side of those who are rejected and exploited by society. Hagar's story reminds us that even in the midst of dark situation, hope springs eternal. Our biblical background: Abraham had two sons. The firstborn was named Ishmael, and the secondborn, the son of promise, was named Isaac. Their birth was separated about 14 years. Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael is filled with failed human attempts to bring God's will and promise to fruition. Genesis 8 through 21 is the conclusion of Abraham's relationship with Hagar and Ishmael in the Old Testament. The conflict in Genesis 21 originated 14 years earlier when Sarah became concerned that she would never be able to give Abraham what he desperately wanted, a son and an heir. Sarah devised a plan to take matters into her own hands and ensure that Abraham would have an heir. Sarah gave her bondwoman, Hagar, to Abraham to be his wife. Eventually, Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to a son and called him Ishmael. After it became known that Hagar had conceived, she was sorely mistreated by Sarah. Broken and hurt by this, Hagar fled the camp and ran into the wilderness, where she was met by the angel of the Lord. Genesis 16, 6 through 9. She was advised to return to her mistress and there live under her authority. Sarah came to despise Hagar and wanted her out of the family setting. In Genesis 21 and 8 and verse 8, Isaac was a healthy baby boy and over time had grown to being weaned from his mother's breast milk. Children were usually weaned from the milk of their mother when they were between 3 and 5 years of age. 1 Samuel 1 and 22, Psalms 131 and 2, Hosea 1 and 8. Abraham went above and beyond what may have been normal. He made a great feast to celebrate the day that Isaac took the next step towards adolescence and eventual manhood. In Genesis 21, 9 through 11, verses 9 through 11 describes the event that led to the banishing of Hagar and her son from the safety and security of Abraham's household. There is no mention of the name of Ishmael in these verses. Sarah does not refer to the child as the son of his father Abraham, but of his mother Hagar the Egyptian. Hagar was not of the same ethnic origin as Sarah and Abraham. Sarah managed to diminish Abraham's and Hagar's son. According to the customs of the day, Hagar's action would have Ishmael instead of Sarah's child Abraham rightful heir. Were it not for the will of God, Ishmael, not Isaac, would have held the rank of the firstborn son and receive a double portion of Abraham's estate. Deuteronomy 21, 16 through 17. Sarah saw Ishmael mocking. This refers to a mocking form of laughter that is intended to humiliate and belittle someone. Job 30 and 1, Habakkuk 1 and 10, Lamentations 1 and 7. Sarah was enraged by it. She demanded that Abraham immediately cast Hagar and her son out of the camp. She followed up her demands by referring to Hagar not as the wife of Abraham, but as this bondwoman. In verses 11, Abraham was heartbroken and deeply grieved by Sarah's demand. He was forced to separate himself from his firstborn son and the wife that Sarah insisted he take. In Genesis 21:12-13, verses 12 and 13 reveals God's response to Abraham's dilemma. God told Abraham not to let Sarah cause him grief. The Lord sided with Sarah and gently led Abraham to see that his promised heir would be the son of Sarah, not Hagar. The most plausible explanation for the Lord's use of the term lad and bondwoman is that Abraham and Sarah could not ultimately usurp the plan of God. They themselves had created the situation that produced Ishmael, and Abraham married to Hagar. The Lord refers to Hagar not as a wife, but as a bondwoman. Although Abraham shared a love for both women, he freely yielded to the Lord's voices. The Lord also made a promise to Abraham that just as he had promised to bring forth a great nation for Abraham's seed, so too would he make a nation of the seeds of Hagar. Genesis 25:12-16. In Genesis 21:14-16, in verse 14, Abraham came to the difficult moment when he had to send Hagar and Ishmael away. It happened early in the morning, allowing the mother and the son to maximize the daylight needed for their journey, or even to make their departure away from the curious eyes of many onlookers. Abraham gave the pair some provisions to sustain them on their journey. Abraham took bread and water and put it on Hagar's shoulder. Then he took the child, placing him in Hagar's care, and sent them away. After receiving the supplies, they departed toward the wilderness of Bathsheba. Hagar directed Ishmael to go and sit under a desert shrub tree. Hagar sat down a bow shot away, a distance of 50 to 75 yards from her son. Hagar's sense of hope was worsened by the fact that she had not heard the promise of God to make of her son Ishmael a great nation. God's promise made it impossible for him to die in the desert. In Genesis 21:17-20, verses 17-21 concludes the account of Hagar and Ishmael and the aftermath of their being forced to leave Abraham's house. The Lord did not respond to the lad. Rather, the angel of God called out to Hagar from heaven and asked a question: "What aileth thee, Hagar?" The angel of God told her that God had heard the voice of her son. God was with them at their very lowest moment. Hagar received the same promise God made to Abraham concerning the boy. Her firstborn son will be the father of a great nation. It was not Abraham, but Abraham's God who would do this for Ishmael. In verse 19, it states that God met their immediate needs for water. Hagar opened her eyes and saw a well of water. she was able to fill her bottle and give the boy a drink. God was with the lad, and he grew and prospered in the wilderness. He became an archer and continued to live in the wilderness of Paran, located in the southern region of the Sinai Peninsula. In closing, number one, family life can be very complicated, especially when there are children involved. Number two, Hagar was never elevated above her rank of a slave. Number three, God met Hagar's need by sustaining her life and hope. Number four, Hagar's story is that of millions of black Christian women in America. Number five, God always remembers those who trust in him. And finally, number six, God is always on the side of those who are rejected and exploited by society. To God be the glory. Thank you.